Hi, my name is Bruce Alberg, and I work with Youth with a Mission in Antigua, Guatemala. Currently, Guatemala, like most of the world, is experiencing the coronavirus outbreak, and many of us are confined to our home during certain parts of the day. Here in Guatemala, the restriction is from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 4 o'clock in the morning. But the Lord has put on my heart a message that I want to share with people today. uh, Looking at the life of Joseph. And Joseph was a man whom God used during times of several crises that happened in his life. And I want to share a little bit about his life and make application to our situation that we are facing now, and maybe you're facing in the same way. But Joseph was a man whom God had put into a situation where he was confronting many different crises in his life. And we want to look at those crises that he faced and how God used them to prepare him for a time when he would be promoted to be the second in command over all of Egypt. So we look at some of the scriptures, and one of the first crises that Joseph faced was the one that he had with his brothers. In Genesis 37:19 through 24, it says, "Then they said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams.' But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, 'Let us not take his life.' And Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he may rescue him out of their hand to restore him to their father.' So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit." So we see the first crisis that Joseph confronted was the crisis created by the jealousy and hatred of his brothers. Joseph was his father's favorite son, was given a special robe. Joseph had the two dreams where people were bowing down to him. And this created a lot of jealousy among his brothers and a hatred that developed over him. So when he came to check up on him, they wanted to kill him and throw him in this pit and get rid of him. And so Joseph was faced with his first crisis, but he had no control over him. So now we see Joseph, the second crisis is that he's taken by the people of Midian and sold as was rescued out of the pit, and now was taken to Egypt, to a new country that he probably had never been to before, and a whole different culture. And so now he's facing this crisis of being placed in another country. And so we see in Genesis 39:1 through 6, it says, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From this time that he made him an overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate." And so we see, even though Joseph was placed in a foreign country, placed in the household of Potiphar to be his slave, Joseph took advantage of it. He didn't quit, he didn't give up, but he took advantage of the situation that God had placed him in, and God gave him favor with Pharaoh and gave him success in everything that he did. So the next crisis that we see in Joseph's life was a crisis that he had in the palace with Potiphar's wife. Joseph was a good-looking guy. And Potiphar's wife, for whatever reason, thought he would be a good person to have sexual relationships with. And so she tried to seduce him every day, but Joseph withstood that. But then one day, out of her frustration, we read in chapter 39, verses 12 through 20, the situation, the crisis now that Joseph was going to be confronted with in the palace. And this is Potiphar's wife. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So the next crisis that Joseph faced is this crisis of injustice, of being falsely accused of trying to rape Potiphar's wife. And because of this false accusation, now he's placed in the prison where he will be serving a 2-year term. And so Joseph gets put in prison. And so now he's in another crisis situation, being in prison and being in a place where certainly he had no control over. But yet, in spite of being in this situation, Joseph made the best of it. And so we see in chapter 39, verse 22 and 23, it says, And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it successful. And so we see that Joseph is now in this prison, but again, he doesn't pout, he doesn't quit, he doesn't look at the situation as being a hopeless situation. I'm just not going to do anything, just serve my time. Maybe I'll get out of here someday. But he had a different attitude. He's in prison, and evidently the keeper of the prison trusted him. There was something about Joseph that he could place the trust in him to put him in charge of things. And so we see Joseph, again, was successful in a crisis situation that he didn't ask for. But while he was in prison, we know the story of the dreams that the butler and the baker had. And so there was another crisis among these two men. And it says in chapter 40, it says, And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with his own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, Why are your faces downcast today? They said to him, We have had dreams, and there was no one to interpret them. Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. And so we see these two shared their dreams. And Joseph looked at them and had compassion on them. And this is another thing that we note about the life of Joseph. He was a man of compassion. He could have just blown these guys off and said, Well, that's your problem. But yet he was concerned for them. And when the dreams were shared with them, God miraculously, supernaturally gave him the interpretation of those dreams. And the results of the dreams was that one was taken and killed, and one was promoted to again serve Pharaoh. But Joseph was forgotten. And so we see another situation of another crisis. Joseph does something good for someone, and he's forgotten about, and how must must have been a difficult thing for him to remember that and think about that. Why didn't this guy remember me? Why did he say something to Pharaoh that I might be able to get out of here? But yet Joseph remained with a positive attitude about what was happening to him. He served his time, and God's hand was still upon Joseph. And so the next thing that we see is a crisis that Pharaoh has. Again, Pharaoh has this dream, and it puzzles him. And so in chapter 41, verse 15 and 16, it said, "And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." And Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And so now Pharaoh's in a crisis of this dream that really troubled him. And there's no one who can interpret it except Joseph. He's counting on Joseph, who interpreted the other two dreams, to be able to interpret his dreams. And Joseph knows that it's not really in him, but it's God who will give him the interpretation of the dream. And so we see that Joseph interprets this dream for Pharaoh. And the dream talked about 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of famine. And so now the dream predicted that there was going to be a crisis in the country of Egypt. And so in Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 through 41, we read the next situation that Joseph was confronted with. He had come up with an interpretation of the dream, and Pharaoh said this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there's none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Because Joseph responded in this crisis of Pharaoh and interpreted the dream, Pharaoh entrusted him with being second in command. And God worked through Joseph to devise this plan to be able to store goods during the 7 years of prosperity so that there would be enough food for everyone for the 7 years of famine. And so we see all these crises that Joseph was involved in, his personal crisis, but also the crisis that was happening in Egypt. The final crisis that Joseph had is when his brothers came to get food to bring back to their father. And this was another crisis that Joseph faced. In chapter 45, verse 7 and 8, we see the resolution of the crisis when Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers, who didn't know that he was this ruler. And his brothers were fearful for their lives because they remembered what they had done to him. And so they were in a crisis. And Joseph, too, was also in a crisis. It's like, wow, here's my brothers. Maybe he could have taken the attitude, well, now's my time to pay them back for the evil that they've done to me. But Joseph had a different perspective of life. He had seen how God had blessed him in spite of the different crises that he had gone through, how God had given him success in all that he did. And so he was able to look back at his life from a different perspective. And he said in chapter 45, verse 7 and 8, he's talking to his brothers, and he said, "And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." So when we look at the life of Joseph, we see that during his years of the trials and crisis that he went through, God was refining and defining his character. God was building a character in Joseph that would be able to carry the responsibilities of being second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph starts out with a couple negative things where maybe he had a little bit of pride about this special coat of many colors that his father had given to him, that his father treated him differently than he treated his other brothers. He was given privileges that his other brothers didn't have, especially with this special coat that he was able to wear. And so there was a little bit of opportunity for Joseph to have pride developed in his life about who he was, and especially the dream that he had about these people bowing down to him. And, there might have been a little bit of pride on his part, thinking that, one day people are going to respect me and they're going to be bowing down to me. And so because of that, there had to be a little act of God intervening here, I believe, and creating a humble heart in Joseph. And so that's the third thing we see here is humility being developed in Joseph's life when he was thrown into that pit. How humbling of an experience must that have been when his own family rejected him, his own brothers, their hatred and their jealousy of him, wanted to kill him. And so they left him in this pit, the humility of now being rescued out of there by a group of Midianites and then sold as a slave into Egypt. And so this was a humbling thing that happened in Joseph's life. But we see that Joseph responded in a different way as a man who was willing to take on responsibility and given responsibility with Potiphar, and even when he was in the palace, and then when he was in the prison. He was given responsibilities, and God blessed him and gave him favor, and he enjoyed success in those situations. And so he showed himself to be a man of integrity. When Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, is like, I can't do this. I can't do this to my master. I can't do this to my God. I have to remain faithful to who I am as a person. And so we see integrity was something that was a part of his life. And then whatever Joseph did, he did it with excellence, and he was successful in what he did. Wherever God had placed him, in the palace and the prison, and when he got elevated as the second in command, he exemplified excellence in all that he did. But we also see how Joseph responded in compassion. When the butler and the baker had these dreams that troubled them, didn't know how to interpret them, and Joseph could see that these men were hurting, and he had compassion on them. He wanted to do something to try to help them, and he was able to interpret those dreams. And the final thing that we see of a character that was developed in Joseph was his ability to be able to forgive his brothers for the horrible thing that they did to him. Joseph was able to look at everything that happened and see how God's hand was upon his life, and that God was the one who had sent him and orchestrated all of this for the preservation of his people. And because of that, Joseph was, I believe, willing to forgive his brothers for what they had done to him. And so when we look at Joseph's work ethic, these are things that I see in his life that all of us need to emulate, is that he sees opportunities wherever he was placed, in the palace and the prison, and in front of Pharaoh. He took the opportunities as the ways to serve other people. He didn't grumble and complain or reject it. He seized those opportunities and made the best of them. We see also that he persevered in spite of injustice. When he was thrown in that prison, what an unjust thing. When he was sold into slavery, and when his brothers threw him in the pit, all these acts of injustice in his life, but yet he persevered and endured them and overcame them. We see also that he utilized his God-given gift of dream interpretation. This was something that God gave him to be able to interpret these dreams of the two men in prison with him, as well as with Pharaoh. And so it wasn't like he didn't want to make his service available to them. He was trusting God and believing that God was going to help him understand these dreams and give the accurate interpretation of them. We see in his life he always accepted a challenge, a promotion to the second in command. Is when Pharaoh wanted to make him the second in command, he could have rejected that. He said, no, this is way too much for me. I don't want to do this. It's too much responsibility. But yet he accepted this challenge of being promoted into a position of great authority and great power in the nation of Egypt. But then we also see that his work ethic was that he had developed a strategy to save the nations based on the interpretation of the dream, as he understood what was going to be happening in Egypt and in many parts of the world at this time where the famine struck. And he developed a strategy, a very wise strategy of being able to save some of the crop each year, that there would be enough when the famine hit to be able to provide for the needs of everyone else. And so we see his work ethic was, he was a hard worker, he was a thinker, he was one who could develop a strategy that was going to save the nation. And then he carried out the details of the strategy over those 14 years of the abundance and the lack. Joseph faithfully carried out this strategy, and because of that, the lives of millions of people were saved. And so when we look at the results of Joseph's life and what he accomplished, first we see that he preserved the nations of Egypt plus other nations around Egypt that had gone through this time of famine. We see that Pharaoh benefited through his actions. He made his boss successful, and that's one of the things that I see about Joseph. He wasn't after his own benefit, he was after the benefit of Pharaoh. How can I make Pharaoh successful? And through the strategy that he developed, Pharaoh became a very prosperous ruler over Egypt. Also, Joseph was able to reunite his family. When his brothers came to visit him, he saw that as an opportunity for him to save his family and reunite his family, to once again be able to see his father and his younger brother. And then when his family came, he put him in a situation where they would prosper. He put them in the land of Goshen, where their herds could be raised and they would multiply. And God prospered his family during these 400 years that they would spend in Egypt. And the final thing, the result was that it fulfilled God's plan to form a nation through whom the Messiah would be born. Joseph maybe didn't understand the ramifications of what he had done, but through this nation that God would form, all these people that were part of Jacob's family that multiplied in Egypt became the nation that God would call out and would deliver from Egypt. And through this nation, the promised Messiah would come through this lineage. And so we see the results of Joseph's life is that he had a tremendous impact on many people's lives. And every crisis that he faced, he turned around and made it into something good. And through his life, he blessed many, many people. In our current situation here in Central America and in Guatemala, where I live, there's many people are out of work. They're not able to go to work, and many people just live from day to day. They don't have a bank account. They don't have a savings account. They don't have anything to rely upon. And so we're looking at this as a Youth with a Mission basis, asking God, what can we do to be able to help people in this crisis? You've called us, you've placed us here for a purpose. What is it that you want us to do to reach out to these people? And so as we began to think about meeting the needs of the people, I wrote to some supporters and asked them if they would be willing to help us financially, that we'd be able to take this money that we can receive and use it to buy material goods, food, and other things that people need to live on a daily basis. And praise God, many people have responded. We've gotten some generous donations that have come in, and now we get to form a strategy and put a plan into action of how we can help meet the immediate needs of these people, but also thinking over perhaps a longer period of time, depending on how long this coronavirus crisis lasts. We want to be able to try to help people for a longer extended period of time. And so when we look at Joseph's life, I see we can summarize his life in these 5 words. First phase of his life, he was pampered by his father, given special privilege and honor, given these special dreams. And he was pampered by his father by giving him this special coat, which created hatred and jealousy among his brothers. The second phase of his life, he was pitted. He was put in that pit and just left by his brothers, they were hoping that a wild animal or someone would come and kill him. But, praise God, God had a different plan of rescuing him and bringing him as a slave into Egypt, where the third phase of his life started, where he was potted in the palace of Potiphar, but also because of the injustice that was done to him, he was placed in the prison, where God used that opportunity, where Joseph became successful in the prison, but also this opportunity he had to be able to interpret the dreams of the butler and the baker, which enabled him to be able to be in a situation anywhere where he could interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. And so we see that his next phase of his life was he was promoted to this position of leadership first in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar entrusted him when he was in the prison. He was promoted in there to be in charge of things. And then finally, he's promoted to be second in command over all of Egypt. And the final thing in Joseph's life, we see that he was praised. Maybe not him directly, but God was praised because Pharaoh recognized that his God was at work in him and that Joseph could be entrusted with this authority and power to help him in the situation of the crisis that they were going to be facing. And so we see even his brothers, I'm sure, were so thankful that when they finally were reunited with him, that they saw how God had used Joseph to preserve their lives and the lives of the whole nation, the descendants of Jacob. And so I just want to encourage each of us during this time of the corona crisis, as God has put each one of us wherever we're at, that we can be like Joseph. We can be one who makes ourselves available and asking God, what can I do in this situation? How can you use my life, my gifts, my talents, and my abilities to be able to be used of you in the situation that I'm currently faced? And I believe that God has a plan for each one of us. This has not caught God by surprise, but it's an opportunity for us as his people to really ask him, to seek him, and respond to the opportunity that he has placed before us to be able to help the people who are around us. So thank you for listening to the message today, and I pray that God will bless you during this time and that you will really seek him as to what you can do in whatever situation that you're facing to be a blessing to the people around you.